Kyle Morrison stepped off the transport shuttle at the Denver spaceport, and his legs felt weak after 14 years of living in artificial gravity on the mining stations beyond Neptune. And the Earth air tasted different than he remembered, and it was thick and full of smells that his filtered station environment had never carried. And he pulled his single duffel bag over his shoulder and made his way through the crowded terminal where families reunited with tears and laughter, and he had no one waiting for him because his father had died 3 years ago, according to the brief message he received on the station. The journey to his childhood home in the Colorado mountains took 6 hours by ground transport, and Kyle watched the landscape change from urban sprawl to rolling hills to the rocky peaks he remembered climbing as a boy. And when the transport finally dropped him at the end of the old dirt road, he felt his heart beating faster because this was the place where he had grown up and where his mother had died when he was 12, and where his father had told him to go make something of himself in the stars. But as Kyle walked up the winding path toward the house, he noticed something was wrong, and there were barriers around the property, and they looked like sheets of translucent crystal that shimmered with rainbow colors in the fading sunlight, and he had never seen technology like this before, and it definitely was not there when he left 14 years ago, and his father had been a simple mechanic who fixed old vehicles and barely made enough money to keep the house running. Kyle approached the main gate cautiously, and immediately a figure appeared from behind one of the large pine trees, and she was tall and impossibly graceful, and her skin had a silvery quality that made her look like she was carved from moonlight, and her ears swept back in elegant points, and her eyes were the most striking thing about her, because they looked like someone had captured pieces of a nebula and placed them in her face in swirling purple and blue that seemed to move as she looked at him. Beside her were 2 creatures that made Kyle stop dead in his tracks, and they were dragons, but smaller than the legends described, and each one was about the size of a large dog, and one had scales that shimmered emerald green, and the other had scales that looked like polished obsidian with veins of red running through them, and both creatures watched him with eyes that held far too much intelligence for simple animals. The woman spoke, and her voice had a melodic quality that seemed to resonate in his chest, and she asked who he was and what business he had at this property. And Kyle felt confused, because this was his home, and who was this alien woman asking him questions, and he told her his name, and that this house belonged to his father, Richard Morrison, and that he had every right to be here. Something changed in the woman's expression, and her eyes widened slightly, and she stepped closer, studying his face intently, and the dragons moved with her, staying close to her sides, and she asked if he was truly Richard's son. And Kyle nodded, wondering how she knew his father, and she seemed to relax and the tension in her shoulders easing, and she introduced herself as Princess Lyria of the Aeltherium people, and said she had been waiting for him for a very long time. Kyle felt his mind struggling to process this information, and an alien princess had been waiting for him, and why would she even know he existed? And Lyria seemed to sense his confusion, and she gestured toward the house and told him to come inside, and that she had much to explain, and the crystalline barriers parted at her touch, and Kyle felt a strange tingling sensation as he passed through them, like walking through a waterfall made of electricity. Inside, the house looked both familiar and completely foreign, and his father's old leather couch still sat in the living room, and the photographs on the mantel showed Kyle as a child with his parents, but there were strange devices scattered throughout the space, and holographic displays floated in corners, showing what appeared to be surveillance feeds of the surrounding forest, and the walls themselves seemed to pulse with a faint blue energy. Lyria led him to the kitchen, where she prepared tea using a traditional earth kettle, and Kyle noticed how carefully she moved and how she seemed to know exactly where everything was in his father's house, and the dragons followed them, and the emerald one jumped onto a chair and curled up, while the obsidian one lay down near the door, watching Kyle with unblinking eyes as they sat at the old wooden table. Kyle asked the obvious question, and what was she doing here, and why had she been waiting for him? And Lyria took a slow breath and began to explain. And 12 years ago, her scout ship had malfunctioned while passing near Earth, and she had crashed in the mountains not far from this house, and she had been injured, and her ship was damaged beyond her ability to repair alone. And Earth authorities would have captured her for study and experimentation if they had found her Richard's Morrison had been the one to find her, and he had been hiking in the mountains when he saw the crash, and instead of reporting it to the authorities, he had helped her, and he had hidden her ship using old tarps and branches, and he had brought her to his home and tended to her injuries, and over the weeks it took for her people to locate her. Richard and Lyria had become friends. Kyle listened, feeling a strange mix of emotions and pride that his father had been brave enough to help an alien, and confusion about why his father had never mentioned any of this in their infrequent communications, and anger that he had been working himself to exhaustion in the mining colonies, while apparently something extraordinary was happening at home. Lyria continued her story, and in gratitude for saving her life, she had offered Richard something precious and samples of L-therium crystal technology, and these crystals could generate massive amounts of clean energy, and each one could power a city for a year without any pollution or waste. And Richard had understood immediately that such technology would be dangerous in the wrong hands, and that wars would be fought over it, and that corporations would kill anyone who stood between them and unlimited power. So Richard had asked Lyria to hide the crystals and to protect them until his son returned from the outer colonies, and he had believed that Kyle would be the one to decide what to do with such a gift, and Lyria had agreed, and among her people a life debt was sacred and she could not refuse, and besides she had grown fond of Richard and his kind heart, and his stories about his son who had gone to seek his fortune among the stars. After Richard's death 3 years ago, Lyria had continued to maintain the property, and she had installed the crystalline barriers for protection, and she had used her people's technology to create surveillance systems, and the dragons whose names were Shimmer and Ash had been gifts from her homeworld and sent to help her guard the secret, and they were young by dragon standards and only 15 years old, and they would live for centuries, and they were bonded to her telepathically and could sense danger from miles away. Kyle asked why she had stayed all these years and why she had not just taken the crystals and left Earth, and Lyria looked at him with those cosmic eyes and said that she had made a promise to his father, and that among her people promises were not broken, and besides, she added with a slight smile, she had grown attached to this place and to the pine forests and the mountain air and the simple beauty of Earth. Shimmer, the emerald dragon, suddenly chirped and jumped down from the chair and approached Kyle cautiously, and the dragon sniffed at his hand and then rubbed its head against his palm, and the scales felt warm and smooth like polished glass, and Kyle felt something shift inside him and a connection forming with this strange creature. And Lyria smiled and said that Shimmer liked him, and that dragons were excellent judges of character. Kyle spent that first night in his old bedroom, and his childhood posters still hung on the walls, and his books still lined the shelves, but he could not sleep, and his mind was racing with everything Lyria had told him. And downstairs an alien princess was sleeping in his father's room, and 2 dragons were guarding a basement full of technology that could change the world, and he had come home expecting to maybe sell the house and move on with his life, and instead he had walked into something that felt like a science fiction novel as dawn light crept through his window. Kyle made a decision, and he would stay, and he would learn everything. Lyria could teach him about the crystals and about her people and about why his father had trusted him with this responsibility, and whatever came next, he would face it, and maybe his 14 years in the cold darkness of space had been preparing him for exactly this moment. The morning sun filled the kitchen with golden light, and Kyle found Lyria already awake preparing breakfast, and she moved around the space with practiced ease, and it was clear she had been living here for years and making this house her own while still respecting his father's memory. And Shimmer and Ash were outside in the yard, and he could see them through the window playing some kind of game that involved chasing each other around the old oak tree. Lyria placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of him and told him that today she would show him the vault and the crystals his father had hidden, and Kyle ate quickly, and his appetite sharpened by curiosity and nervousness, and he had spent half the night wondering if this was all some elaborate dream, and if he would wake up back in his cramped quarters on the mining station. After breakfast, Lyria led him down to the basement, and Kyle remembered this place as dusty and full of his mother's old belongings and boxes of his childhood toys, but now it had been completely transformed, and the walls were lined with the same crystalline material as the barriers outside, and they pulsed with a soft blue light, and in the center of the room stood a cylindrical containment unit that hummed with barely contained energy. Lyria placed her hand on a panel beside the containment unit, and the surface became transparent, revealing dozens of crystals inside, and each one was about the size of his fist, and they glowed with internal light that shifted through various colors and blue and green and purple and white, and Kyle felt drawn to them. And there was something hypnotic about the way the light moved within each crystal. She explained that these crystals were grown, not mined, and that her people had been cultivating them for thousands of years, and each crystal was alive in a sense and connected to a vast network of energy that existed between dimensions, and the Aetherium had learned how to tap into this energy safely and efficiently, and one crystal could power a city like New York for an entire year without producing any waste or pollution. Kyle did the math in his head, and there were at least 50 crystals in the containment unit, and that was enough energy to power half of North America for a year, and he understood now why his father had been so careful, and why he had asked Lyria to hide them, and in the wrong hands, this technology could shift the balance of global power, and corporations would go to war over it and governments would kill to control it. Lyria told him that his father had been wise beyond what she expected from a human, and Richard had immediately grasped the implications, and he had not been tempted by wealth or power, and instead he had thought only of protecting his son, and of making sure the technology was used responsibly. And she said that Richard had spent the last years of his life researching Earth history and studying how new technologies had been used and abused throughout human civilization. Kyle felt emotion tightening his throat, and he had always known his father was a good man, but he had not realized how good and how selfless. And he asked Lyria what his father had wanted him to do with the crystals, and she said that Richard had left instructions and written documents that outlined his thoughts and his hopes for how the technology might be introduced to humanity gradually and carefully. She led him to a desk in the corner of the vault, and inside a drawer was a leather journal, and his father's handwriting filled every page, and Kyle opened it and began to read. And his father's voice seemed to come through in the words, and talking about responsibility, and about the dangers of greed, and about his hope that Kyle would have gained wisdom during his years in space, and that he would understand the weight of this decision. The journal outlined a plan, and Richard had suggested creating a foundation and something independent of any government or corporation, and the foundation would slowly introduce the crystal technology through controlled channels, and first to hospitals and schools and water treatment facilities, and places where the energy could directly improve lives without creating massive economic disruption. Kyle read for hours while Lyria sat quietly nearby, and Shimmer and Ash eventually came down to the basement, and curling up at Lyria's feet, and the Emerald Dragon occasionally looked up at Kyle with those intelligent eyes and as if checking to make sure he was okay. When Kyle finally finished reading, he closed the journal and looked at Lyria, and he asked her what she thought of his father's plan and whether she believed it could work, and Lyria considered the question carefully before answering, and she said that among her people there were strict rules about sharing advanced technology with younger species, and the Aetherium had learned through painful experience that giving too much too fast often led to disaster, but she also said that Earth was unique, and that humans had something her people had lost over their long history, and humans had hope and resilience, and a stubborn refusal to give up even in the face of impossible odds, and she had seen this in Richard, and she believed she saw it in Kyle as well. And if anyone could handle this responsibility, it would be him. Kyle spent the next several days learning everything he could about the crystals, and Lyria taught him how to safely handle them and how to read the energy signatures and how to interface with the dimensional network they connected to. And it was the most complex technology he had ever encountered, and it made the mining equipment he had operated for 14 years look like Stone Age tools. During breaks from studying, Kyle got to know the dragons better, and Shimmer was playful and affectionate, and loved to have the scales behind her ears scratched, and Ash was more reserved and watchful, but equally intelligent, and Kyle learned that they could communicate basic concepts to Lyria telepathically, and images and emotions rather than words, and they could sense danger and illness and deception in humans. One afternoon, while Kyle was reviewing his father's notes, Lyria told him that there had been 3 attempts to infiltrate the property over the past 2 years, and corporate spies looking for whatever secret technology Richard Morrison might have left behind, and rumors had spread in certain circles and whispers about alien tech and unlimited energy, and Lyria and the dragons had detected each attempt and driven the intruders away without violence, and simply by revealing enough of their capabilities to frighten them off. Kyle felt a chill run down his spine. And he had been working in the outer colonies completely unaware that people were hunting for his inheritance, and that his home had become a target, and he asked Lyria if she thought more would come, and she nodded, and said that once he started implementing his father's plan, the attempts would intensify and powerful. People did not like losing control, and they would not give up easily. That evening, Kyle sat on the back porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, and Lyria joined him in bringing 2 cups of tea, and they sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Shimmer and Ash chased fireflies in the yard, and their scales glowing faintly in the dusk, and Kyle realized that his life had changed completely, and he could never go back to the simple existence he had known on the mining stations. He told Lyria that he had decided to follow his father's plan, and he would create the foundation and introduce the technology slowly, and he would do everything he could to make sure it benefited everyone and not just the wealthy and powerful. And Lyria smiled and said she would help him, and she had pledged her life to protecting this secret, and that pledge now extended to protecting him. Kyle asked her about her own people and whether she missed her home among the stars. And Lyria looked up at the emerging constellations and said that she did miss it sometimes, and the cities of light, and the songs of her people, and the way time moved differently there. But she had found something on Earth that surprised her, and she had found purpose, and she had found friendship with Richard, and now with Kyle, and she had found that helping others was more fulfilling than she had ever imagined. As darkness fell and the stars became visible, Kyle felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders, and he was 28 years old, and he had spent his adult life operating mining equipment in zero gravity, and now he was being asked to change the world, and to introduce technology that would revolutionize human civilization and to stand against those who would use it for harm. And it was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Shimmer jumped onto the porch and curled up beside Kyle, and resting her head on his knee, and he stroked her scales absently, and the dragon purred and a sound like distant thunder. And Lyria told him that the dragons had accepted him, and that they would protect him, as they protected her. And Kyle felt grateful for that, and he suspected he would need all the protection he could get. That night Kyle dreamed of his father, and in the dream, Richard smiled at him and told him he was proud, and that everything would work out. And when Kyle woke the next morning, he felt more certain than he had in years, and he knew what he had to do, and he would honor his father's memory, and he would work with Lyria to bring clean, unlimited energy to a world that desperately needed it. Kyle spent the next 2 weeks working with Lyria to establish the foundation his father had envisioned, and they registered it as a nonprofit organization called the Morrison Energy Initiative, and Kyle used most of his savings from 14 years of mining work to cover the legal fees and initial operating costs, and Lyria contributed her own resources and knowledge that was worth more than money. They set up the foundation's headquarters in the house and converting one of the spare bedrooms into an office, and Lyria helped Kyle understand the complex legal requirements, and she had spent years studying Earth laws and governments and economic systems and preparing for this moment, and her knowledge was encyclopedic, and sometimes Kyle forgot she was not human until he caught sight of her pointed ears or saw her eyes flash with that nebula light. The first challenge was finding people they could trust, and Kyle needed lawyers and engineers and scientists who would believe in the mission and who would not be corrupted by greed or ambition. And Lyria suggested they start small and find one person who could help them navigate the initial legal complexities, and someone with integrity and experience. Kyle remembered his father's old friend Helen Baker, who had been a patent attorney before retiring 5 years ago. And she lived in Boulder and had visited their home several times when Kyle was young. And Helen had always been kind to him and had a reputation for being honest and principled, and he decided to reach out to her. When Helen arrived at the house 3 days later, her eyes widened at the sight of the crystalline barriers, and Kyle and Lyria had agreed to be honest with her and to show her everything, and hoping that his father's trust in her had been well placed, and Helen was a small woman in her 60s, with gray hair and sharp eyes, and she studied Lyria with open curiosity, and asked the question Kyle had been expecting, "And what exactly are you, Lyria?" Explained her origins calmly and told Helen about the crash and Richard's rescue and the life debt, and Helen listened without interrupting. And when Lyria finished, Helen sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked to see the crystals in the vault. Helen examined the containment unit and watched the crystals pulse with inner light, and Kyle explained the energy potential and the clean, unlimited power and the implications for climate change and global energy poverty. And Helen asked technical questions that revealed her sharp mind and her ability to grasp complex concepts quickly. Finally, Helen asked the crucial question, and why show her this, and what did they want from her? And Kyle told her about the Foundation, and about his father's plan to introduce the technology gradually, and about the need for legal protection and structures that would prevent corporations or governments from seizing control. And Helen nodded slowly, and said she would help them, but only if they agreed to complete transparency and no secrets and no shortcuts. Over the following weeks, Helen worked tirelessly to establish the legal framework for the Foundation, and she created bylaws that prevented any single person or entity from gaining majority control. And she set up oversight boards and independent auditors, and she built protections into the structure that would make it nearly impossible for the Foundation to be corrupted or bought out. During this time, Kyle continued, learning from Lyria, and she taught him about her people's history. And the Aeltherium had once been aggressive expansionists and conquering other worlds and imposing their will. But a catastrophic war had taught them humility. And now they explored, peacefully and sharing knowledge only with species that proved ready for it. Shimmer and Ash became constant companions to Kyle, and the dragons followed him around the property and played games that helped him understand their intelligence and their personalities, and Shimmer loved puzzles and challenges and could manipulate objects with surprising dexterity, using her clawed feet. And Ash was more contemplative, and often sat watching the sky for hours, as if remembering a home among the stars. One morning, Kyle woke to find Lyria standing at his bedroom window looking tense, and when he asked what was wrong, she told him that Ash had sensed intruders during the night, and 3 people trying to approach through the forest, and the dragons had alerted her, and she had activated additional barriers, and the intruders had retreated. But they would be back. Kyle felt fear grip his chest, and it was one thing to know intellectually that powerful interests would come after the technology, and it was another to realize that danger was literally at his doorstep. And he asked Lyria what they should do, and she said they needed to accelerate their plans, and the sooner they made the technology public, the safer they would be. Helen agreed when they told her, and she said that once the crystals were being used in multiple locations and once the Foundation was fully operational, it would be much harder for anyone to simply steal the technology or eliminate them. And she suggested they choose their first partner carefully and somewhere that would generate maximum positive attention. They decided on a children's hospital in Denver, and St. Joseph's had been struggling with high energy costs and had been forced to cut programs, and Kyle contacted the hospital administrator and asked for a meeting, and explaining that he represented a new energy initiative that wanted to help, and the administrator agreed, and probably expecting some kind of solar panel donation. The meeting took place on a Tuesday afternoon, and Kyle and Lyria and Helen sat across from the hospital administrator, Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, and 3 board members, and Kyle explained the Morrison Energy Initiative and its mission to provide clean, unlimited energy to institutions that served the public good. Dr. Rodriguez was polite but skeptical, and she had heard many promises from people claiming to have revolutionary technology, and Kyle had expected this, and he placed a small crystal on the conference table, and the crystal was about the size of a golf ball and glowed faintly, and he told them this crystal could power their entire hospital for 6 months. The board members exchanged glances, and one of them asked if this was some kind of joke, and Lyria spoke up, and her voice carrying that melodic quality that made people pay attention, and she offered to demonstrate, and if they would allow them to connect the crystal to the hospital's backup generator system, they would prove its capabilities. Dr. Rodriguez considered for a moment and then agreed. And what did she have to lose? And they moved to the hospital's mechanical room, where massive generators sat ready for power outages, and Kyle and Lyria spent 30 minutes installing a specialized interface that Lyria had built, and connecting the crystal to the system. When they activated it, the crystal flared bright, and energy readings on the hospital's monitors spiked and then stabilized at levels that should have been impossible, and the crystal was generating enough power to run every system in the hospital, and lighting and medical equipment and heating and cooling, and it did so without any fuel and without any emissions, and the generators sat silent and unnecessary. Dr. Rodriguez stared at the readings in disbelief, and she asked how this was possible and where the energy was coming from. And Lyria explained in simple terms about dimensional energy and quantum field tapping, and the board members looked lost. But Dr. Rodriguez, who had a background in physics, understood enough to realize this was far beyond current Earth technology. Kyle told them the Foundation would provide the crystal and all necessary equipment free of charge, and the hospital would only need to agree to allow independent monitoring of the system's performance and to participate in case studies that would help them refine the technology. And Dr. Rodriguez asked what the catch was, and there had to be a catch. Helen explained the Foundation's structure, and its nonprofit status and its mission, and she assured them there was no catch and the Foundation was funded independently and sought no profit and only wanted to demonstrate the technology's potential. And Dr. Rodriguez looked at Kyle and asked why he was doing this and why give away something so valuable. Kyle thought about his answer carefully and then told her about his father and about Richard's belief that some things were too important to be owned by any one person or company, and that energy was a basic human need, and that making it freely available would lift billions of people out of poverty, and would solve the climate crisis, and would give humanity the resources to reach for the stars. Dr. Rodriguez smiled and said that if this technology did what they claimed, it would be the most important breakthrough in human history, and she agreed to the partnership, and the board members nodded their approval, and Kyle felt a weight lift from his shoulders, and they had taken the first real step. Over the next month, Kyle and Lyria worked with the hospital's engineers to integrate the crystal technology fully, and replacing the old systems and training staff on basic maintenance, and the results were immediate and dramatic, and the hospital's energy costs dropped to nearly zero, and they were able to restore cut programs and hire additional staff, and word began to spread. News outlets picked up the story, and reporters wanted to know about this mysterious new energy. Source and Kyle gave carefully prepared statements, and he emphasized the Foundation's nonprofit mission and the potential to help similar institutions worldwide, and he did not mention aliens or dragons or the crystal's true origins. And Lyria stayed out of the public eye, and her appearance would raise too many questions. The threats escalated quickly, and within 3 months of St. Joseph's Hospital going public with their new energy system, the Morrison Energy Initiative had become a target for powerful forces that saw the crystal technology as a threat to their interests, and oil companies watched their stock prices drop, and energy corporations faced obsolescence, and even governments worried about losing the geopolitical leverage that came from controlling energy resources. Kyle received a visit from 2 men in expensive suits claiming to represent a consortium of energy companies, and they offered to buy the Foundation for an amount of money that would have made Kyle wealthy beyond imagination. And when he refused, they became less friendly, and they warned him that fighting against established industries was dangerous and that accidents happened to people who did not understand the rules of the game. After they left, Lyria told Kyle that Ash had sensed deception and malice from both men, and the dragon had wanted to intervene and to drive them away. But Lyria had held him back, and she said the men would report back to their employers, and that more direct action would likely follow. And Kyle felt fear, but also determination, and he would not be intimidated into abandoning his father's dream. Helen suggested they accelerate the Foundation's expansion, and the more installations they completed, and the more public support they gained, and the harder it would be for anyone to stop them, and Kyle agreed, and over the next 6 months the Foundation installed crystal energy systems in 20 schools and 15 hospitals and 3 water treatment facilities, and each installation generated positive news coverage and public enthusiasm. But the corporate interests adapted their strategy, and instead of threatening Kyle directly, they began a sophisticated disinformation campaign, and news articles appeared questioning the safety of the new technology, and paid experts warned about unknown risks and social media filled with conspiracy theories about dangerous experiments and regulatory agencies, suddenly announced investigations into the Foundation's activities. Kyle was exhausted from fighting battles on multiple fronts, and he spent his days dealing with lawyers and responding to regulatory inquiries and managing the Foundation's growing operations, and his nights worrying about what attack would come next. And Lyria remained his steady anchor and her calm presence and ancient wisdom helping him navigate each crisis. One evening, as they reviewed documents in the office, Shimmer suddenly burst through the door, and her scales flashing with agitation, and the dragon made urgent chirping sounds, and Lyria immediately stood and told Kyle that intruders were approaching, and multiple people and heavily armed, and this was not a reconnaissance mission, but an assault. Lyria activated the full defensive capabilities of the crystalline barriers, and the shimmering walls around the property solidified and became opaque, and additional layers materialized, creating a fortress. And she told Kyle to get to the vault and to protect the main crystal store, while she and the dragons dealt with the intruders. And Kyle wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes stopped him, and this was what she had been trained for and what she had prepared for over years of waiting. Kyle ran to the basement and sealing the vault door behind him and through the security monitors Lyria had installed. He watched events unfold outside, and 12 armed men in tactical gear approached the house and carrying weapons that looked military grade, and they began trying to breach the barriers using cutting tools and explosives, but the crystalline barriers held and absorbing the impacts and dispersing the energy. And Lyria stepped out onto the porch, and her appearance transformed, and she wore armor that materialized from her skin and flowing metal that seemed alive, and her eyes blazed with cosmic fire, and beside her, Shimmer and Ash had grown, and their bodies expanding to 3 times their normal size, and their scales glowing with inner light. The intruders froze at the sight and whatever they had been told to expect. It clearly was not this, and Lyria spoke, and her voice amplified and carrying across the property, and she told them they had one chance to leave peacefully, and that she did not want to harm them, but she would protect what was hers. One of the intruders raised his weapon and fired, and the bullet never reached Lyria, and it stopped in midair and held by some invisible force, and then dropped harmlessly to the ground, and Shimmer roared, and the sound was nothing like her usual chirps, and it was a deep, thunderous challenge that shook the windows, and Ash took flight and his wings spreading wide and glowing like forge fire. The intruders broke and ran, and their courage failing in the face of something beyond their understanding, and they scattered into the forest, and Lyria let them go, and she had made her point, and anyone watching through whatever surveillance they had would report back that the Morrison property was defended by forces far beyond normal human capability. Kyle emerged from the vault shaking, and he had watched everything on the monitors and had felt utterly helpless. And Lyria had returned to her normal appearance, and the armor vanishing and the dragons shrinking back to their usual size, and she looked tired and sad. And she told Kyle that violence always saddened her, and even when necessary and even when in defense. That night, Helen came to the house, and her face grave, and she had received word through her contacts that the attack had been ordered by a coalition of energy companies, and that they had hired a private military contractor, and that when those men reported what they had seen, there would be questions, and dangerous questions, about what exactly Kyle and Lyria were protecting. Helen said they needed to make a choice, and they could continue trying to hide Lyria's true nature and the full extent of the technology, and risk more attacks and more escalation, or they could go public with everything, and trust that transparency would be their best protection, and it was a gamble, but Helen believed it was their only real option. Kyle looked at Lyria and asked what she thought, and this would expose her and would change her life completely. And Lyria was quiet for a long moment and stroking Shimmer's scales absently, and then she said that her mission had always been to help humanity, and that perhaps the best way to do that was not through secrecy, but through honesty. And if humans knew the truth, and knew that another species was willing to share such gifts freely, and perhaps it would inspire them to be better. They made plans carefully, and Helen arranged for a press conference, and Kyle would tell his father's story, and would explain the crystal technology, and would introduce Lyria as an Eltherium princess, who had chosen to help Earth, and they would demonstrate the dragons and show the crystalline barriers and leave no doubt about the extraterrestrial nature of what they were offering. The press conference was held at the Denver Convention Center, and hundreds of reporters attended and skeptical and hungry for a story, and cameras from every major news network pointed at the stage where Kyle stood with Lyria beside him, and Shimmer and Ash sitting calmly at their feet, and the dragons had agreed to this and to being revealed, and because they understood the stakes, Kyle told the story exactly as it had happened, and his father finding a crashed alien and choosing kindness over fear, and forming a friendship that transcended species and being trusted with technology that could change the world, and choosing to protect it until his son was ready. And the reporters listened, and some looking skeptical and some fascinated and all taking notes furiously. Then Lyria spoke, and her voice filling the hall with that melodic resonance, and she explained her people's history and their long exploration of the galaxy and their policy of carefully sharing knowledge with species that showed promise. And she said that Richard Morrison had shown her the best of humanity and kindness and wisdom and selflessness, and that she believed humans were ready for this gift. She demonstrated the crystal technology and powering the entire convention center's lights and sound system and climate control with a single small crystal, and the energy readings were verified by independent scientists who had been invited to observe. And then she showed them the crystalline barriers and creating a shimmering wall across the stage and letting reporters touch it and feel its solidity. Finally, Shimmer and Ash performed and flying around the hall, and their scales glowing and demonstrating their intelligence by solving complex puzzles and responding to commands, and the dragons had practiced this and knowing that winning human hearts would be important, and they succeeded, and even the most skeptical reporters smiled at the creatures' grace and obvious affection for Lyria and Kyle. The questions came rapid fire, and was this real, and could other aliens be among them? And what did this mean for Earth governments and for the economy and for religion and for everything? Humans thought they knew about their place in the universe, and Kyle and Lyria answered patiently and honestly, and admitting what they did not know and explaining their mission and their hope for humanity's future. The press conference lasted 4 hours, and when it ended, Kyle felt drained, but also relieved, and the truth was out, and there was no taking it back and no hiding anymore, and whatever came next they would face it openly and honestly. 2 years after the press conference that changed everything, Kyle stood in the main hall of the newly constructed Morrison Energy Institute and watched as delegates from 70 nations gathered for the first Global Energy Summit, and the building itself was a marvel and designed by human and Aetherium architects working together, and its walls made from living crystal that generated power while providing light, and the structure was both functional and beautiful, and a symbol of what cooperation between species could achieve. Lyria stood beside him, and wearing formal Aetherium attire for the occasion, and flowing robes that seemed to shift color with her movements, and her presence was now familiar to millions of people around the world, and she had become the face of peaceful alien contact, and children drew pictures of her, and Shimmer and Ash and politicians quoted her speeches, and scientists collaborated with her daily. The dragons had grown larger and more majestic over the past 2 years, and Shimmer now stood as tall as a horse, and her emerald scales gleaming like precious stones, and Ash had developed deep crimson markings along his obsidian scales, and both dragons served as unofficial ambassadors in visiting schools and hospitals and helping humans become comfortable with the idea of intelligent alien life. Helen Baker had aged visibly from the stress of managing the Foundation's explosive growth, but she remained sharp and dedicated, and she had built a team of hundreds of lawyers and administrators and engineers, and together they had overseen the installation of crystal energy systems in over 10,000 locations worldwide, and hospitals and schools, and water treatment plants, and agricultural facilities and disaster relief centers. The impact had been staggering, and energy poverty was virtually eliminated in regions where the Foundation operated, and clean water became available to communities that had never had it, and hospitals in developing nations could finally afford to run modern medical equipment, and schools could power computers and internet connections, and giving students access to education that had been impossible before. But the transformation went deeper than just energy, and the crystal technology had sparked a renaissance in human cooperation, and nations that had been rivals found common ground in their desire to build a better future, and scientists from different cultures worked together on projects that would have been impossible before, and the threat of climate change that had loomed over humanity for decades began to recede, as fossil fuels were rapidly phased out. Kyle had become a reluctant public figure, and he gave speeches at universities and met with world leaders and appeared in documentaries about the new era of human-alien cooperation. And he always emphasized his father's role and Richard's vision and wisdom and the choice to prioritize humanity's well-being over personal gain, and the world had largely embraced Richard Morrison as a hero and the man who had saved humanity by showing kindness to a stranger. The summit began with opening remarks from the UN Secretary-General, and who thanked Kyle and Lyria and the Morrison Energy Initiative for their unprecedented generosity and for proving that a better world was possible, and the delegates applauded, and representatives from nations that had barely been speaking to each other 2 years ago now sat side by side. Lyria gave the keynote address, and her voice filling the hall without electronic amplification, and a natural gift of her people. And she spoke about the Eltherium civilization's long history, and about the mistakes they had made, and the wars they had fought, and the lessons they had learned, and she told the assembly that humanity had a choice, and they could follow the path of cooperation and growth, or they could squander this gift and return to old patterns of conflict and greed. She said that her people had been watching Earth for centuries, and waiting to see if humans would mature enough to join the galactic community. And Richard's act of kindness had convinced the Eltherium Council that humanity was ready, and that the decision to share the crystal technology had been controversial among her people, and some had argued that humans were too violent and too divided, but Richard had proved them wrong, and now it was up to all of humanity to continue proving them wrong. The delegates listened in rapt attention, and when Lyria finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, and Kyle saw tears on many faces, and the weight of her words and the hope they carried was overwhelming. Over the next 3 days, the summit tackled practical issues and how to expand the crystal technology to more remote regions, and how to handle the economic disruption as traditional energy companies transitioned to new business models, and how to ensure that no nation or group gained unfair advantage from the technology. And the discussions were intense but productive, and there was a spirit of cooperation that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. During a break, Kyle walked in the Institute gardens with Helen, and she told him she was planning to retire soon, and that at 72 she had earned rest, and Kyle felt panic at the thought of losing her guidance. And Helen laughed and told him he did not need her anymore, and that he had grown into the role his father had envisioned, and that he was ready to lead the Foundation forward without her. Kyle wanted to argue, but he knew she was right, and he was not the uncertain young man who had returned from the mining colonies 2 years ago, and he had learned to navigate politics and media and corporate pressure, and he had built relationships with world leaders and scientists and ordinary people who believed in the mission, and most importantly, he had learned to trust his own judgment. That evening, Kyle hosted a private dinner for a small group, and Helen and Lyria and Dr. Patricia Rodriguez from St. Joseph's Hospital, and Ambassador Chen from the Eltherium diplomatic mission, and a few others who had been crucial to the Foundation's success. And they gathered in Kyle's home, in the house where it had all begun and where Richard's spirit still seemed to linger. They shared stories and laughed and remembered the early days when everything had seemed impossible. And Dr. Rodriguez talked about how the crystal technology had saved lives at her hospital, and how children who would have died from lack of power for critical medical equipment were now thriving. And Ambassador Chen spoke about how the Eltherium Council was considering sharing additional technologies and advances in medicine and materials, science and agricultural techniques. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave Lyria, and Kyle found themselves alone on the porch where they had spent so many nights over the past 2 years, and Shimmer and Ash were sleeping in the yard, and their large forms peaceful in the moonlight, and the air was cool and filled with the scent of pine. Kyle told Lyria that he had been thinking about his father, and about how Richard could never have imagined the scale of what they had accomplished, and the Morrison Energy Initiative now operated on every continent and touched billions of lives, and Richard had been a simple mechanic in the Colorado mountains, and yet his choice to help a stranger had literally changed the course of human history. Lyria said that Richard had understood something profound, and that small acts of kindness could have enormous consequences, and that one person choosing to do the right thing could inspire millions of others. And she said the Eltherium had a saying, and that the flutter of a single wing could shift the winds of entire worlds, and Richard's wing had certainly fluttered. Kyle asked her about the future and where she saw things going in the next 5 years and 10 years, and Lyria said that her people believed humanity was ready for deeper integration into the galactic community, and that within a decade humans would likely be traveling to other star systems and meeting other species and participating in the great conversation that had been happening among spacefaring civilizations for millennia. She said that the crystal technology was just the beginning, and that the Altherium had knowledge that could extend human lifespans and cure diseases and terraform dead planets, but all of that would be shared gradually, and as humanity proved ready for each new step, and the foundation Kyle had built would be crucial in managing that process. Kyle felt the weight of responsibility but also excitement, and his father had given him an extraordinary gift, and not just the crystals, but the opportunity to be part of something greater than himself, and to help guide humanity into a new age, and it was terrifying and thrilling and humbling all at once. Lyria sensed his emotions and the bond they had developed over 2 years, allowing her to read his moods, and she placed her hand on his and told him he was not alone, and that she would be beside him for as long as he needed her, and that the dragons would protect him, and that millions of humans now believed in the mission and would support him. Kyle realized that somewhere along the way, he had stopped thinking of Lyria as an alien and as something foreign and strange, and she had become his closest friend and his partner in every meaningful sense, and someone he trusted more than anyone, and someone whose presence brought him peace and strength. And he wondered if this was what his father had felt, and if Richard had found the same comfort in Lyria's steady companionship.